Welcome to Encounter, where we celebrate putting faith into action and community leaders who live out compassion, grace, and love. We're a program of the Broome County Council of Churches that addresses food insecurity through CHOW and the Greater Good Grocery, provides hospital and jail ministry, builds wheelchair ramps, and assists neighbors with transportation and shopping services through Faith in Action volunteers. We invite you to the conversation. Encounter your neighbors as we learn to walk together in love and kindness.
Good morning. Welcome to Encounter. I'm your host today, Joe Sellepack. I'm the Executive Director at the Broome County Council of Churches. Black History Month is the month of February. It's a time for us to talk about how Black history is American history in a lot of ways, and all the ways that we have cooperated with between races, as well as allowing ourselves the freedom to see the benefits that Black people have given to us in our American experience. One of the places where, especially locally, where these two streams come together is right here in the southern tier of New York. The Underground Railroad, which will be talked about in a documentary coming up on WSKG on February 17th at 7 and at 9:30, is called North to Freedom. It talks about the Underground Railroad and its path through Broome County. And to help me talk a little bit about this are two people who have been featured prominently within the documentary by Brian Fry. Brian interviewed Brenda Cave James, who is a local historian, also a poet. She is a member at Trinity AME Zion Church. And welcome to Encounter.
Thank you.
And of course, the Reverend, nearly Dr. Damond Wilson, who is the pastor at Trinity AME Zion Church. And there's a historical marker right out in front of your church, isn't there? And
yes, there is.
You want to talk a little bit about that historical marker?
Sure,
what
yes.
it specifies?
Yes, we would love to. So this past June, Trinity AME Zion Church was blessed with the opportunity to be recognized as a stop on the Underground Railroad here locally. So for those who are not aware, Binghamton University created a trail that marked some of the important places here in the Binghamton area that was associated with the Underground Railroad. So the church has two markers, actually. One is at the location for the original church, which is what is modern-day Columbus Park. But we also have another marker where we currently worship, which is in the historic First Ward District.
And the Underground Railroad is an interesting subject, isn't it, Brenda?
Yes, it is. It's fascinating.
So, do you want to let us know a little bit about what actually it was? Because I mean, there's a lot of misconceptions about the Underground Railroad and other kinds of things. So, do you want to help us out with that?
Sure. Well, it is not an underground railroad. People still, not just children, but adults, I still get questions like that. Like, how did they do that? It was a network of freedom finders, and I don't like to say fugitives because that implies that they've done something wrong. Freedom finders making their way towards freedom, and a group of good folks helping them to do so safely because it was dangerous. It was dangerous for the freedom seeker, of course, and for the, as we say, conductors or the assistants. They could lose their property, they could be imprisoned, and the temperature at the time was very hot, just like now politically. It split families, churches, and communities. So it was a clandestine situation.
So it's the clandestineness of it, the fact that it was hidden, that made it underground, right?
Correct.
It wasn't because of the physical place of it. It was more.
Correct.
You're right.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. And so these conductors, these folks that, again, because it wasn't necessarily a railroad, railroad was kind of like a popular title at the time, right? So
Yes.
so we were busy putting in railroads everywhere, and so this became that was one of the reasons that they wanted to make railroad a part of that too, right?
Well, I have heard and I have read this, and I don't know if it's true, but it could be. The term was coined when a slaveholder was chasing one of his escaping enslaved persons, and they just at the edge of the Ohio River, they just disappeared. And so, he disappeared like there was an underground railroad, something to that effect. That's the story. I don't know if that's correct, but it has been likened to a railroad with the terminology: conductors, safe houses, trains.
Excellent. And so we had, as you indicated, Damond, there were local safe houses or safe places for slaves. Do you want to help us see where some of those places might have been?
Well, several that I'm aware of, and I think that Sister Brenda can give a little more detail as far as actual locations, but starting with the church. The church at its original location over off of Susquehanna Street had spaces built within the church to house the freedom seekers as they were making their move or their transition north. Also, too, there were also, as Sister Brenda stated earlier, homes that were welcoming to individuals who were on their way. One aspect, you mentioned the documentary earlier, one aspect the documentary highlighted was that Binghamton was a thoroughfare, to where how I like to correlate it to how we have I-88, we have I-81, I-86, 17, and it seems like in Binghamton there's multiple avenues that you can go. And I think the documentary does a really good job of showing how Binghamton was that thoroughfare also for the Underground Railroad. So we see freedom seekers going into Owego, that area. We see freedom seekers going up to Syracuse and then going over to, towards the Deposit area. So we see that how intricate role Binghamton played in helping freedom seekers go to wherever their end destination was located.
Yeah, well, I was noticing that I had done a little reading, and 26, which was kind of like the Freedom Road at the time, because it went right through the middle of Binghamton, right?
Correct. Well, I would say back up a little bit to Montrose, Pennsylvania.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and we had a church there. We had an AME Zion church. There were at that time there were AME Zion, African Methodist Episcopal Zion, or Bethel churches, many all over the place. And they were just small, little, humble places of worship, nothing grand or wonderful necessarily. But so, say coming up from Scranton to Montrose, and we had a church there. There were three fingers. I call it three fingers of freedom out of Montrose. One going over to Owego, and on north Ithaca, all points north, Auburn, where Harriet Tubman ended up living, and then another one coming over through Vestal, going up through Endicott and Union, and from there, if necessary, they could cut west to Newark Valley or keep going down to Whitney Point and up 26 through Willett to Peterborough. And the other finger of freedom out of Montrose was, say, coming up present-day Pennsylvania Avenue, Front Street, Green, on up to Peterborough was often a very safe place to get to, because Garrett Smith and the other abolitionists in the group would help support and usher folks to Canada.
Now, Garrett Smith, he was a prominent white person within our area, right? You want to talk a little bit about his background?
Yes, he was a very, very wealthy landowner. His father, he inherited a lot of wealth from his wealthy land-owning father,
Right.
and they were into politics. And he was a very forward-thinking, liberal-minded person and believed in freedom, hated slavery. He was friends with Frederick Douglass, with Harriet Tubman, and with the Reverend Jermaine Wesley Logan, who I boast about, preached in our church and spent time here in Binghamton. Syracuse always gets the credit for Reverend Logan, but he was here for several years.
Why don't we hold it up again so that everybody can
yes,
see it?
okay.
Yeah.
Reverend Jermaine Wesley Logan, who was himself a self-freed, once enslaved person. And he escaped on the Underground Railroad from Tennessee, found his way, made his way across up to Canada, almost lost his life several times, educated himself, came back down, and made it his business to preach against slavery and teach people to read and write, because he was an adult before he could do so.
So he was a pastor of the pulpit that you preach in.
Yes,
he was.
Yes.
So what's it like? What's it like following in the footsteps of these people, Damond?
You know, it's a powerful legacy, and it reminds me that you can't take the position lightly.
Right.
There is a emotional but also a spiritual weight that comes with sharing a pulpit with amazing ministers who have fought for freedom. So as Sister Brenda alluded to earlier, Logan was a pastor there, but we also had some stalwarts of the abolitionist movement who participated in the Zion connection.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner
Sojourner
Truth.
Truth was
Right.
another
Sure,
one.
sure.
Right.
So she came through Binghamton.
So she was in another part of New York. I forgot which part of New York she came through, but she's also a part of the AME Zion tradition.
Correct. Sojourner Truth actually was born and enslaved near Albany, New York.
Albany, New York.
Near Albany, New York. And the indignities that she endured,
Yeah.
you wouldn't, I could talk all day long about some of them. One of them being forced to bear her owner's child. And then later, when that child was stolen, she fought to get her child back. But we can boast about that as well, having the great abolitionist came out of our church organization.
Yeah,
And Harriet Tubman.
Was she the one? Which one wrote the book "Ain't I" or the poem "Ain't I a Woman"?
That would be Sojourner
Sojourner
Truth.
That's the one I thought.
Yes, indeed, Sojourner Truth.
Yes.
And it was, initially it was a speech in Ohio, and at that time, white women who spoke publicly were considered to be crazy.
Right.
And called everything but a child of God. But for a formerly enslaved black woman to stand up and give a tremendous speech about the rights that she did not have, and isn't, ain't I a woman? At one point, she bared her breast to make her point. It just turned the whole place upside down, and that speech has been, through time, turned into a dramatic piece or a poem, you could say.
So my guests today are Damond Wilson, who is the pastor at Trinity AME Zion, Brenda Cave James, who's a local historian, poet, as well as the historian for the church.
Well, I like to say church historian.
Church historian.
Not historian in general. I love history, but I'm not comfortable with just being called a historian.
Yeah.
But a church historian, yes, I love my church's history. I'm a fourth generation AME Zion member.
And so, one of the things that I think, because I am a doctor, so it doesn't surprise you that I do a lot of reading, but there was a book by Timothy Smith called Revivalism and Social Reform that was written a long time ago, well longer ago than I even care to admit, but I read it when it was fresh off the press. So I'll tell you a little bit about my age at the moment. And some of my heroes have long passed on, and Timothy Smith is one of them. But revivalism and social reform talks a lot about the burnt-over district of New York, which is all the way up from Binghamton's a part of it, as well as Rochester, all the way over to Albany, all the areas that we've been mentioning it. And the Underground Railroad kind of comes through that area in order to get up to Canada. So it kind of followed in a lot of ways. Even if you were to go into the Second Great Awakening down through Pennsylvania and other places like that, it followed closely a lot of the revivalism that was going on through the that was like a interdenominational, so to speak, movement that kind of brought together what they, Methodists as well as Baptists as well as a lot of various denominations. And so the Underground Railroad mirrored that in some ways. And how did, like, when you think about that, Damond, how does that revivalism part of it enter into the discussion as we look at the Underground Railroad?
Yeah, I think that it plays a vital role in changing the consciousness of how people understood slavery and it as an institution. I believe that the revivalism established that slavery is a sin.
Right.
So prior to that, it was really more considered an economic tool.
Right.
So people didn't think of it in religious terms.
Right.
So I believe that because of the revivalism and the changing of the spiritual consciousness of people started to see it for the horror that it really was.
Right.
Because sometimes, like, when you're able to kind of compartmentalize and just kind of say, okay, this is just a business venture versus, no, this is a moral, spiritual catastrophe. It opens up a broader view for people who weren't interested before.
Right.
And for one thing that doesn't get spoken about as much is that there were actually major rifts in some of the largest denominations over slavery.
There was.
So, that's why we have the ABC and the Southern Baptists. That's
Right.
why we saw the split away of denominations like AME Zion and the first denomination, historically black denomination of AME, coming out of the Methodist Church.
Right.
Because this was a major event, and again, because of that spiritual awakening, they were able to see how wrong slavery was in a new light.
Right.
Yeah, the denomination that ordained me way back when is the Wesleyan Church. And the Wesleyan Church was a breakoff from the United Methodist Church over the issue of slavery. We were the radical abolitionists, if you can believe it. So
Right,
Orange got a bunch of other people like that. We're all a part of the abolitionist movement, and we didn't feel like even after the North and South split that the North had actually gone far enough,
Right.
which is why we kept a separate denomination. So if you go up to the Women's Rights Hall of Fame and all of that stuff up in Geneva, what's the name?
Geneva, I believe.
It's near Lake
Casanova.
Geneva, but I can never remember the name of the town. But it's a Wesleyan church that Frederick Douglass
Right.
preached from,
Correct.
and it was part of the women's suffrage movement as well,
Right,
which is
right.
kind of an interesting thing, right?
So yes, indeed. And let me say, Reverend Logan, when he found himself in Canada and became educated and free, he took on the name Wesley as his middle name, Jermaine
Wow.
Wesley Logan, for that purpose. And he added the N on to Logue, which was, he was his owner's child, which was common, sadly. His mother was a very young girl when she bore him. not by her will. So he added N on to Logan, and he took on the middle name Wesley for that purpose. And he chose our organization because of its stance against slavery. Yes.
Well, that's
Yes.
really interesting, and I what a great history for a past, especially a pastor of a church to have. You know,
Right,
it's-
right.
and a legacy to leave on for other people.
Sure. And he's the one, when I had said earlier, there were many AME Zions all over, scattered all over this part of New York State. He was responsible for starting many of those. There was one in Deposit, two in Schoharie, Cortland. They were everywhere. And he traveled on horseback to all of them. He was a circuit preacher. And he spent a lot of time also in Montrose preaching and ushering people to hide in Montrose, in the church in Montrose. And my great-great-grandparents had been enslaved in New Jersey. They moved to Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, and down the road from the church. And I would like to believe, because it was the very same time period, that perhaps they had the good reverend to their home for dinner. I just really, why not?
Right.
They
Right.
were
That's amazing.
members of the church at that time.
Right.
That's awesome.
That's
Isn't it?
amazing.
So,
That's
so,
amazing.
so tell me, what was it like? February. So we are going to be seeing. It will be coming out on North to Freedom on February 17th. People can see it at both 7 and 9:30 that evening. What was it like to be a part of like that kind of a documentary? It must have been a little bit nerve-wracking, but
So I'll go first because Sister Brenda played a very crucial role in not only the making of the documentary. She supplied information, and she also had a hand in its editing. So I'll let her go second, so she can go and tell you all the amazing things that she's done. But for me as a pastor, it's amazing to see that Binghamton has contributed so much.
right.
Because I don't know if we mentioned it before, but Pastor Logan is actually considered the king of the
Yes,
Underground Railroad.
yes.
And to have his legacy associated with Binghamton means a lot.
Yes.
And, being able to say that so many freedom fighters have either come to Binghamton for different purposes and helping freedom seekers make their way north. It's like I said earlier, it's a legacy that you can't take lightly. And just being able to see that on the screen and see it just displayed so elegantly, how Binghamton played a major role in the movement, it's just awe-inspiring.
Yes, yes. I have to agree with you. And I want to say our Reverend's lovely wife, First Lady Wilson, she was the choir directress for our Freedom Choir, and we sang in the documentary as well.
So yeah, I'm
And
sorry.
I-
She's gonna get to me if I don't mention her. So yes, my wife did a wonderful job getting together people from the community, which we call the Freedom Choir.
Choir.
And we practiced several of the old Negro spirituals, and we came together as a collective group, and we were able to be a part of the soundtrack for the documentary.
Oh, wow.
So
Yes,
if you
yes.
listen to the final credits and you hear the soloist, that's my wife.
That's
Yes,
your wife.
indeed.
Excellent.
Beautiful. And she did a tremendous job. I think Brian Fry did a great job. And much of the documentary was about the coming together, black folks and white folks working together. And I appreciate the fact that one of the professors on the documentary mentioned that often the black church is left out of the whole mix. Oftentimes not given enough credit for being and managing the Underground Railroad. And I agree with that tremendously. Even though it was a mixed race thing, abolitionists and the black church is often enough credit is not given, and that's why I'm so appreciative to Professor Ann Bailey of our own BU for arranging the historical marker in front of our church and putting us on the Underground Railroad map. Broome County, finally, we're on the Underground Railroad map. And one more thing about the great documentary, it focused a lot about the social aspects, and of course, I agree, and I said this myself, often the tunnels are romanticized and such, but there are some homes in this area with physical hiding rooms in them. They weren't always necessary, but after the 1850s law was passed where slave owners could come up here and snatch their property, sometimes it was necessary to hide for a few hours or maybe a few days. So there are homes in Broome County, one in Whitney Point, one in Nanticoke. There's one right by my house in West Corners. There was one in Vestal up near Choconut with physical hiding spaces. So some of that is romanticized, the tunnel thing for the most part, even though there were some, but there were indeed physical hiding spaces, many in Owego. And I speak to that because imagine having to hide in a tiny space for hours or days in the dark and cramped quarters, and maybe you were cold or hungry and you couldn't come out. Just imagine that.
In the middle of winter.
Yeah, in the middle of winter, exactly, in the middle of winter. So I that part fascinates me, as well as the social part of it, of people coming together.
So after emancipation, once the war is done and all the rest of that, the cause of civil rights didn't end there, did it?
No. It just took a new form.
Right.
So going into a little bit of what we saw is that, yes, slavery by constitutional amendment, was ended in most forms. It wasn't ended in all forms, but we see now, what is called the Negro problem.
Right.
Now that the Negro is free, what do we do with them? And for a long time, it was, let's incarcerate. Let's create laws that'll, discriminate so that we can get them back into a form of slavery. That's why we call it penal slavery now, because of the criminal justice system, which we kind of still see to this day. But all of it was not bad. All of what has transpired since slavery has the determination of a people. People have come together and created wonderful communities against all odds. So that's kind of what we see post-slavery, is that we see, like locally in Binghamton, the 7th Ward, part of the 8th Ward, where thriving black communities came and established themselves. And although they still experience some of those issues, we are continuing to move forward.
And it's that history that I'd like to celebrate today too.
Right.
So thank you, Damond and Brenda, for being on Encounter today. February 17th at 7 o'clock and 9:30, people can see the documentary, North to Freedom. And for all of you, I would pray that you would be good and gentle with each other today. Thanks for being on, for watching Encounter and being on.